What's up everyone, it's Dakota and welcome back to another Pioneer video. And as we encroach ever closer to the Pioneer RCQ season, that at the time of the recording of this video is in about like 2 weeks. You know, like this is probably going to be the last weekend for non-RCQ events till we kind of get into the season for it. Actually, I'm even wrong because Apex Gaming is going to have their Apex Con that is going to be in RCQ for the event, but I believe it's modern. Don't quote me on it. But of course, we're going to be looking at a Pioneer deck this week that is at least in the top 2, and some would argue that it's not 2. So we're going to be looking at the Izzet Phoenix deck, kind of going over it in terms of kind of what you're looking for when you're playing this deck. It's very much like this weird, like combo kind of tempo-y deck that, you know, has been kind of doing the same thing for a long time, really since Arclight Phoenix was printed back in the Guilds of Ravnica set, you know, way back when, in like that, you know, the Return to Ravnica, as people dubbed it back then. So maybe to date myself a little bit. But, you know, before we get too deep into the Izzet Phoenix deck, of course, if you're not already subscribed to the channel and you want to see more content like this, I do a lot of modern and Pioneer content along with some other longer form videos, including a podcast that we do on Saturday. So if you want to see any and all of that content, please consider subscribing and ring notification bell so you know when those videos get posted. And if you go into the description down below, you will find 2 links, one to the deck list of this player in particular that ended up actually winning the challenge this past weekend, and of course my link to my Discord server, so if you want to join over there as well, talk about Magic, anything and all like that, please consider doing so. I really appreciate it. Really cool getting some new people over there, you know, talk about Magic and things like that. You know, it's like one of my favorite games. You know, I only base my whole YouTube channel around it. So yeah. So Izzet Phoenix, we all know, I think at this point, you know, for a lot of players, you know, this isn't anything new. Like this deck was, you know, one of the best decks in the format, you know, pre-ban, when we got Geological Appraiser and Karn the Great Creator banned, and really since then has continued to be, you know, before the Pro Tour, before Murders of Karlov Manor, it was like the best deck going into the format. You know, between that and maybe like Rakdos, but, you know, I think people were solidly on Izzet Phoenix being one of the best decks in the format. Now it's at worst the second best deck in the format, which when that's kind of like your worst case scenario, some would argue you're in some pretty good shape. So the Izzet Phoenix deck is based around this card, Arclight Phoenix. 4-mana 3/2 Flying Haste, you know, nothing super impressive about that. Like, it's barely passable, maybe as a limited card in that sense. But it has this neat little ability, if you will, this neat little bit of text that says at the beginning of combat on your turn, if you've cast 3 or more instant and sorcery spells this turn, return Arclight Phoenix from your graveyard to the battlefield. So if you cast any combination of 3 or more instants and or sorcery spells this turn, you're able to get Arclight Phoenix back. Now, getting 1 Phoenix back is kind of whatever. I mean, you have a bunch of these spells that cantrip. You know, you have Considers, you have Ops, Sleight of Hands. You know, so really you're not like spending cards to like get this to get Arclight Phoenix back. Of course, the real power in the deck is when you have 2, 3, 4 Phoenixes in your graveyard and you're, you know, bringing them back after maybe, you know, lightning axing something important, and then, you know, sleight of handing to go find like another spell, and then like casting something like a Torch Tower, Spikefield Hazard, what have you, getting back Phoenix, you know, disrupting your opponent's board while also immediately putting pressure on them. So we've kind of talked about, you know, a few spells that, you know, are pretty good, in particular, you know, casting, making sure that you have enough gas to actually get the Arclight Phoenix back. How are we getting these in the graveyard? A big one is the card Picklock Prankster. So the Free the Fae adventure part of Picklock Prankster says you mill 4 cards, you put an instant, sorcery, or fairy card from among the milled cards into your hand. So Picklock Prankster can go and find other Picklock Pranksters. It can go and get, you know, Consider, Fiery Impulse, Spikefield Hazard, you know, your Treasure Cruises, Temporal Trespasses, you know, things like that. On top of, you know, just also getting to find other copies of itself, and it gives you another spell to cast later, which is pretty important with the card Ledger Shredder, which is also another way that you can kind of get like incremental value and dig just an extra card deeper to find Phoenixes and try to ditch them or just get rid of cards that you really don't need. So we all know Ledger Shredder, you know, a 2-mana 1/3 flyer Bird Advisor, whenever a player casts their second spell each turn, Ledger Shredder connives. So even when your opponent on each of their turns, or on your turns, whatever, if they cast their second spell, you're going to get to connive with Ledger Shredder, which I think is like one of the hardest things to remember about this card, because you see like a lot of people like don't trigger their Ledger Shredder when their opponent casts 2 spells, only really when they cast 2 spells, and Ledger Shredder cares about both players on either turn casting 2 or more spells. And it's pretty easy, you know, to play Ledger Shredder on like turn 3, play this, and then play like an Opt or whatever, and then you get a connive with Ledger Shredder. Maybe your opponent double spells on their turn 3, so you get another connive, and then you go to your turn, and, you know, you can really kind of go off with something like a Picklock Prankster to mill 4 cards. Maybe you hit a Phoenix, and you cast like an Opt, and then you're able to connive with Ledger Shredder, and then, you know, draw a discard, and then you go and Opt, and things like that. And then, hey, you have a Lightning Axe, and you're able to discard another Phoenix. There's 3 spells. You have like a 3 or 4 power flyer in Ledger Shredder, and you have, you know, 2-3 Phoenixes coming back and hitting your opponent. So that's basically how the deck's set up. You have like a Brazen Borrower here too, it's just like a nice little catch-all, and can also be a pretty aggressive card. Plays at instant speed very well. The fact that Petty Theft is an instant in itself, and then Brazen Borrower itself has flash. You go even further, you have Prismari Command, which is just kind of a nice utility card to have. Deal 2 damage to any target, you know, kills a decent amount of like the format stuff, like some of the other like smaller tier vampires and like the Rakdos deck. You can kill some other Arclight Phoenixes, things like that. A lot of the time though, you're going to end up using this for the draw 2, discard 2, and then potentially even creating like a treasure token as well to kind of give you a little bit of extra mana, you know, if you're just kind of like, you just need to cast like a few extra spells, maybe deal with some more stuff on the board, you know, draw 2, discard 2, and create a treasure token, I would imagine, are the most useful modes, but I can see some spaces for like dealing 2 damage and destroying an artifact can come up. Then the bread and butter of this deck, kind of like one of the most broken things you can do, is this card, Galvanic Iteration, in conjunction with these Delve spells. So Galvanic Iteration says that whenever you cast your next instant or sorcery spell this turn, you copy that spell. You may choose new targets for the copy. It's a blue and red to cast it. It's an instant, so you can do this on your opponent's turn to cast something like a Consider, or like an Opt or whatever, to look at some extra cards, or cast like a removal spell and get to hit 2 things. And it also flashes back for 1 generic and a white, or a blue and a red. So casting this card and then casting something like a Temporal Trespass, you get 2 extra turns. When you have, you know, 2-3 Phoenixes in play and like a beefy Ledger Shredder, you're going to end up being able to kill your opponent a lot of the time. Like that in itself, I would say 95 to 99% of the time is game ending. But what isn't game ending but feels like the game is over is kind of like your Phoenix opponent has kind of went through a bunch of cards. You know, they're sitting with like 2-3 cards in hand. And you're like, okay, if I deal with the board, maybe I'll be okay. You know, I get rid of their 2 or 3 Phoenixes. It's going to be a little bit harder. And then you find out their last 2 cards are Galvanic Iteration and Treasure Cruise, and they just get to draw 6 cards for 3 mana. Absolutely insane. Treasure Cruise is probably one of your better cards in the deck. Probably, arguably, the best card not named Arclight Phoenix or Ledger Shredder, in the fact that, you know, for essentially 1 mana, you're going to get to draw 3 cards. This is like a way that you can, on like those early turns, like turn 3, whatever, you know, where you like end step a Picklock Prankster, you know, to mill some cards. Like you can go cast like 1 mana spell and a 1 mana spell and a Treasure Cruise. You're going to be able to have like 1 or 2 cards left over for, you know, to get back like 1 or 2 Phoenixes, what have you, and then you've gassed back up. So even if your opponent is able to, you know, clear your board, have some kind of like Pyroclasm effect, you know, you got to draw 3 extra cards, and then you're also going to have a draw step. You know, you're going to be able to, in a lot of cases, rebuild from that point and be able to attack your opponent and really put a bunch of pressure on them. Going even further, you know, like we see the one Spikefield Hazard like as a double face land. Aside from that, you know, you're playing 18 actual lands with like 2 Hall of the Storm Giants. This is like a way that, you know, eventually towards the end of the game, you're going to be able to attack with a 7/7 Ward 3. It's going to be hard for your opponent to deal with. You have an Otawara, which is kind of like standard for a lot of these decks. And then, of course, like a bunch of dual lands in like Riverglide Pathway, Spire Bluff Canal, Steam Vents, Storm Carved Coast, and 2 islands. The sideboard is where things get interesting because obviously, as the Izzet Phoenix deck, I think game 1s are not necessarily free, but that's kind of like your best game. You know, for a lot of graveyard decks, game 1 is the best because there's not really any graveyard hate if at all. Like, no dedicated graveyard hate. You know, like, we've seen, like, Graveyard Trespasser. Like, that was just a good card that, like, players were playing, and it also just had, like, the added benefit of being able to attack the graveyard. Not so much happening now, so I think game ones are a little bit better, short of some pretty busted draws from, like, Rakdos Vampires or even, like, Amalia and things like that. But even then, like, you do have some ways to disrupt kind of what's going on. But in the sideboard, you know, you want to kind of have like a game plan for what's going on. So this deck opting for 3 Young Pyromancer. Whenever you cast a sorcery spell, you create a 1/1 elemental creature token. So this is like a way that, okay, your opponent, you know, has like Leyline of the Void. Maybe they have like a Tormod's Crypt just sitting out there. Like, Young Pyromancer is going to be able to kind of give you value and force them to use like the removal spells and things like that on Young Pyromancer. Of course, in conjunction with like Ledger Shredder, because Ledger Shredder, again, is just like a very efficient, you know, 2-mana flyer that is going to incrementally get you value, especially in like the early games where it's more than likely your opponent's going to double spell, and when you and your opponent want to double spell, you're going to get that value with Ledger Shredder and potentially find fuel for Young Pyromancers, or maybe even find like Crackling Drakes and things like that. Play like Brazen Borrowers, just other ways to like disrupt your opponent. This deck is opting for things like a Braid, Aether Gust, Disdainful Stroke, Negate, and sideboard, along with Unlicensed Hearse. I imagine for a lot of like the mirror stuff. Of course, you can mess with Amalia a little bit from like the graveyard and even the Lotus Field decks and things like that. Ashiok Dreamrender, again, kind of the same thing. It's going to stop your opponent from searching their library, along with getting to mill like any player and then exiling each opponent's graveyard. So you can mill yourself with Ashiok. Like, if your opponent doesn't have any like kind of graveyard hate or whatever in play, Ashiok could just be 3 mana, mill yourself for 4, exile your opponent's graveyard. You know, it kind of pulls double duty in that sense, where it's going to get rid of your opponent's graveyard like you wanted to, and then also fuel your graveyard for things like Crackling Drake, getting back Arclight Phoenixes, things like that. You know, Brazen Borrower, again, is just kind of like another like utility-ish kind of option where you're going to get to bounce any non-land permanent your opponent has, and then get to play a flash 3-power flyer. Brotherhood's End pulls double duty and getting to deal damage to each creature, each planeswalker, destroy all artifacts with mana value 3 or less. This is a little bit better than Anger of the Gods, even though you're playing like 1 copy in here, you're playing 1 copy of Brotherhood's End. There's going to be times where you want Anger of the Gods, and Brotherhood's End is like a way that you could like wipe the board, like where you could just do this like pre-combat and like conceivably, you know, kill your own Phoenixes and then bring your Phoenixes right back, you know, after casting 2 more spells. Mystical Dispute for like the other blue decks and stuff. And yeah, that's kind of what the Izzet Phoenix deck has going on. As I stated in the beginning, it's at least, like at worst, the second best deck to play in the format. I think you can maybe make an argument for third if you really want to put Amalia like in the top 2, but you know, it's, you know, at the very worst, probably the second best deck in the format. It's very consistent, just with all the cantrips and everything like that. It kind of attacks the metagame in the current way that you want to, where a lot of its removal spells are pointed like at creatures, and you know, short of like Vein Ripper and stuff like that, every removal spell in this deck like hits one of your opponent's creatures and does it very efficiently, while of course also putting adequate pressure on your opponent. And that's kind of like the name of the game. And some of these Eternal formats is like, you don't really have time to dirtle and dawdle and everything like that. You have to be able to put pressure in play and force your opponent to have very specific answers for the things that are going on. And this deck just kind of puts your opponent in that corner of like, you need to have, you know, something like an Anger of the Gods, and you have something like a Brotherhood's End, and most decks just aren't playing that. You know, like Amalia can wipe the board, you know, and has the potential to do it at instant speed, but at the end of the day, you know, if you can't keep any creatures on board and your opponent is hitting you for 6 to 9 damage each turn, you know, not even including, you know, potential Ledger Shredders or Brazen Borrowers that get going, you're in a pretty rough spot, really, as most of the metagame, because if you stumble, this deck can absolutely just run you over, and then has so many options in game 2 and game 3, it can find a way to win one of those games, especially, again, the fact that it's going to be a little bit worse for them than the pre-boarded games. So that's going to do it for me in this video. Hope you all enjoyed. If you did, please leave a like on the video. Comment down below if there's another Pioneer deck that you would like to see kind of featured on the channel. Of course, check out the deck list. The link is in the description down below, along with the link to a Discord server. Go ahead, join over there. Comment, subscribe, you know, any and all that stuff to kind of support the channel and support what we're doing over here. And yeah, that's going to do it for me in this video. Hope you all enjoyed, and I hope to see you all in the next one.